Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and I'm so glad you're joining me for another episode in the Kadie Major case. We had a little break because of me being sick, and then Thanksgiving got in the way. So here's a brief recap of what we've covered so far. In the first episode, we looked at an overview of the entire case. And the second episode covered the timeline from a few days before Katie died through her funeral. And then the last episode, we very painfully trudged through the statement that Katie's husband Aaron gave to police, and then his interview with Detective Jerry Merrithew. In this episode, we're going to look at some of the evidence that was discovered from their so-called investigation. And then in the next episode, we'll look at the actual investigators who bungled this case. If you need to get caught up on this case, the link to the playlist is in the description box. And if you're listening to this episode rather than watching the video, I'll have the images that I'm going to be talking about on agathamay.com, and I'll leave a link for them in the description box as well. So let's start by looking at whether or not Katie was actually hit by a train. I don't really think anyone knows for sure, at least not anyone investigating. It seems as if she would have purposely thrown herself into the side of a train, then she would have been completely maimed. I mean, trains are big, they do big damage. They can knock a semi off a track like it's nothing. And I do realize that getting hit head on by a train has a greater impact than running into the side of it, but I still think there would have been a lot more damage. And we'll talk about that more in the next episode when we look at the chief investigator on the case, Rick, I don't recall, Olick. In a previous episode, I mentioned the possibility that Katie was hit by a truck rather than a train. So I wonder if any of the trucks available to Aaron, her husband, were checked for DNA. Was Katie's own truck checked? How do we know that the reason that Katie didn't take her glasses that night was because Aaron was the one who was actually driving the truck, not her? And I have to wonder if their neighbors were ever questioned to see if they might have seen either of them leaving that night. Maybe Katie had jumped from the truck and ran down the railroad tracks, thinking that Aaron couldn't follow her in the truck because she didn't realize there was an access road along the tracks. There are other reasons I think that Katie could have been hit by a truck rather than a train. One is her height. I saw a photo of her where she's standing by a kitchen cabinet, and it doesn't look like she was necessarily very tall. I'd guess she was about 5'4" or 64 inches. And I've looked at multiple photos of the type of train that might have hit her, and it seems like she would have had lacerations on her chest, neck, and even her face if she'd run into the side of a train. Here's a photo of a man standing next to the same model of train that possibly hit Katie. The golf cart in this picture is around 69 inches tall, so the man's probably around that same height. And the wheelbase of the train is at his chest, and he's standing on flat ground. So I think if you take off some of his height and put him downhill from the train, I think his chest and his face would be damaged if he ran into the train. But according to Katie's autopsy, her cause of death was a contusion to the heart from blunt force trauma and femoral artery bleeding from the laceration on her leg. So I don't understand how the train hit her to tear open her abdomen and leg, but not her chest. In his interview with Jerry Merrithew, Aaron mentioned that for a while that night, he had sat in the parking lot of the Bilo shopping center trying to figure out what to do. Well, I was curious to see if there was a particular business in that area, and after I looked on a map, I discovered there was. And that business was a car wash. I mean, someone could have used the excuse of just sitting in a parking lot trying to figure out what to do while they were actually washing evidence off their truck. But wouldn't the truck be dented if he had hit her with his truck? Well, not necessarily. Not if a truck had a brush guard on the front, and I don't know that his did or didn't. And if Katie was hit by a train, which one was it? The initial investigator said she ran into the side of southbound cargo train G74115 that went through the area at 10:38 that night. Now that particular train didn't have a camera on it, but the train that went through at 11:30 p.m. did, and it showed a body beside the railroad track. So does that necessarily mean that Katie was hit by the 10:38 train? Well, the case was reinvestigated in 2019, and the new investigators said they didn't think it was a southbound train at all. They say it was a northbound train. And in an article that was published by the Post and Courier, it mentioned that it was an Amtrak train, so not a cargo train either. So if the original investigators said it was the wrong kind of train going the wrong direction, what else did they get wrong in the investigation? I looked up the schedule for Amtrak the day that Kadie and River died, and train number 98 was scheduled to leave North Charleston, heading north at 8:44 p.m. There was a 2-minute delay. But if that was the train that killed Kadie, she died sooner than 10:38. The train would have been going through Moncks Corner roughly around 9:15. According to Berkeley County Sheriff's Department, a resident on Oakley Road thought he heard a baby crying outside of his residence at 8 o'clock that night. If that baby was River, that's an hour and 15 minutes if the train that hit Kadie was the Amtrak train. Now, it wouldn't have taken her that long to walk from where her truck was parked to where her body was found. So what was going on in that hour and 15 minutes? This is the statement of the railroad employee who found Kadie and River's bodies. Quote, "This is my statement. It is being written by Detective Merrithew at my request. Around 8:30, and this is AM even though they didn't put that on there, around 8:30 I was going down our CSX access road from Oakley Road. As I was driving down the railway, I saw what appeared to be trash in the way. I was here to demolish a beaver dam that had a trestle blocked. When I looked into the retention pond around 8:25, I saw what looked like a doll in the water. I then eased my vehicle up, and then I saw a shoe. I could see that there was what appeared to be another piece of trash just past the shoe. I then eased past the shoe, and as I got closer, I was able to identify the supposed trash as a body. I then called 911 immediately and backed away from the scene. I never got out of my vehicle around the body. After I backed over the bridge, I exited the vehicle, and I made sure that it was a doll. I identified it to be a baby. Berkeley County Dispatch Dan called back for directions, and I told them I thought there was a baby in the water. I do remember that when I was on the bridge, I noticed 2 pieces of remains on the tracks." End quote. So the employee would have been driving south down the tracks from Oakley Road. And if Kadie was hit by a northbound train and was holding River at the same time, would River have been thrown 50 yards away from Kadie without any injuries other than a bump on her head? And how did she get thrown so much farther than Kadie did? I'm guessing that the original investigators never had the train that they thought hit Kadie check for her blood on it, since they didn't even have the correct train. And if you want to know how incompetent they were, here's an image of them measuring a train to see how tall it is from the tracks. So the image shows someone holding a yardstick against a train, but they're measuring it from a flat railroad track. And the railroad track where Kadie was found is on a berm, so the train would have been higher from where Kadie was standing. I would think that it's just common sense that a measurement from a flat track wouldn't be accurate, but I also think that maybe common sense is a rare commodity in the original investigators. So let's talk about the clothing that Kadie and River had on that night. In the 48 Hours episode that was about their case, there were photos of shoes found on the tracks, and they would have been the shoes that Kadie was wearing. And if the images were from the actual crime scene, why were her shoes untied? And why isn't there blood on them? Maybe it was just photos they set up for the episode, but to me they look a lot like crime scene photos. And we learned in the last episode that baby River wasn't wearing a coat. And I still have trouble believing that Kadie would have taken her out on a cold night when it was sleeting without having her bundled up. And here are some photos of the clothes that Kadie was wearing the night she died. And I will be the first to say that I'm not anywhere an expert on any of this, so I'll let you look at the pics and tell me what you think. But I do wonder how her jeans were ripped in the front and in the back without the 2 tears corresponding. Meaning there's a shorter vertical tear up the back of the leg right in the middle, and there's also a vertical tear on the right seam and a horizontal tear across the top of both legs. To me, it looks as though the jeans ripped from right to left. So if she was hit by something that was hanging off the train, how did the vertical tear in the back happen? And if it was a northbound train, Kadie would have had to have had her right side to the train, which meant she was walking back towards Oakley Road, not the opposite way. And in the last episode, I questioned whether or not Kadie could have been coming from the opposite direction, and I think this is more indication that she might have been. I've only seen snippets of the autopsy report, but there is information in what I've seen that goes from strange to just plain wrong. The report states that according to the coroner, quote, "The decedent is a 26-year-old female who, according to her husband, had been upset about the United States presidential election and Muslims taking over the country. While upset on 1/16/08 at approximately 8:30 p.m., she left her home with her 1-year-old infant. She drove her truck and parked near a railroad track. At approximately 8:30 p.m., someone saw her walking away from her truck, end quote. So this is the first time that there's been any mention of Kadie being worried about the election. It wasn't mentioned in Aaron's initial statement to the police and wasn't mentioned in his interview. So where did this information come from? And River wasn't a year old, she was only 10 months. And I suppose the truck being close to the tracks is relative, but it was 500 feet away, and that's not what I'd call close. But 500 feet being close or not close isn't anything compared to this bit of the autopsy report. Quote, a CSX employee saw her vehicle on the side of the railroad track and her body on the side of the track. Approximately a half a mile from this location, the infant River Major was seen floating in a creek, end quote. So let's take a little Google Maps trip from the spot where Kadie's truck was found to the railroad tracks. Well, there's no way that any CSX employee saw her truck from where it was. And it definitely wasn't on the side of the railroad track. I also don't know where they got that River was found a half a mile from Kadie. She was 50 yards from Kadie. I don't know how there's this much misinformation in just the small chunks of the autopsy report that I've seen. I mean, this is bad. And on February 11th, 2008, Dr. Kimberly Collins with the Medical University of South Carolina wrote in her final report that, quote, the manner of death is best deemed pending. But somehow, in the report that the Berkeley County Coroner's Office released on February 22nd of that same year, they state that the final report they received from Dr. Collins indicated that the manner of death was suicide. So, were there two final reports that indicated two different manners of death? And what would have happened in those 11 days to make her change her mind? And it couldn't have been any evidence from the investigators because their investigation sucked. So, did Dr. Collins actually change the final report, or did Berkeley County change it for her? And even though the final report of the autopsy wasn't until February 8th, the county registrar filed a death certificate for Kadie on January 28th that indicated that her death was a suicide. It seems to me that Berkeley County really wanted this to be a suicide. I don't think I've cleared anything up on this case. I think it was handled so poorly from the beginning that I don't know if the truth will ever come out unless it's in a confession. I have had to veer away from my normal rule of following Occam's razor with this case because there's just too many what ifs because we don't know enough of the facts. And that's where we'll leave it for this episode. In the next episode, we'll look at the investigators who handled Kadie's case. Thank you so much for being here. If you've made it this far, please give the videos a thumbs up so YouTube will think that more people need to watch it. I'll be back soon with the next episode of Kadie Major tracking down her killer. Until then, stay safe and be happy.